With Ferguson on edge and prosecutors set to soon announce whether Officer Darren Wilson will face murder charges for shooting and killing Michael Brown, today Attorney General Eric Holder condemned leaks of information from the investigation that he says are trying to shape public opinion. Leaks about Officer Wilson's grand jury testimony, when he reportedly said he feared for his life, that Brown attacked him in his car and grabbed for his gun.
Any day now, a grand jury will come to a final conclusion on whether or not to issue an indictment in the shooting of Ferguson, Missouri victim Michael Brown. They will have to weigh the evidence, the facts. They will have heard from witnesses. And if the experts are to be believed, police officer Darren Wilson will not be indicted, as there will be not enough proof that his shooting of Brown was in any way illegal or improper. And it is that likely possibility that has every member of local law enforcement on edge, along with a community seeking justice and preparing now for the worst. Welcome to Midpoint. She is a retired sergeant in the Los Angeles Police Department. In her 20-year career, working in such notable groups as the Crash Unit, they target some of the toughest gangs in Southern California. She is also author of Black and Blue, The Creation of a Manifesto. It is a pleasure to welcome Cheryl Dorsey into the show today. Sergeant, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Sergeant, in your experience then with the Los Angeles Police Department, certainly you have seen social media grow. You've seen 24/7 media grow. You've seen all these various networks that cover a story over and over again. With all this and with all the flashpoint indicators that are sitting there in Ferguson right now, is it almost impossible at this point not to see a population that is already inflamed, and almost impossible to tamp it down before something really happens?
Well, you know, my problem with that whole situation is that I'm fearful that I hope that there's no violence, number one, and I fully expect that Officer Wilson won't be indicted, number two. And my concern is that now it seems to be officers are just readily using the fear, I was in fear for my life, as an excuse to murder citizens, and that causes me great concern.
Is it not, though, when you look at what's happened to society now, where more people are carrying illegal weapons, where not just guns, but knives and so many other forms of weaponry that people can use now, wouldn't it be fair to say, though, that the basic cop on the beat now has a good reason to fear for his or her life?
Listen, officers receive an inordinate amount of training, and so we expect that there are bad actors out there. But you have to use common sense, and you have to rely on your training, and you can't just broad blanket everyone with a brush and say that everyone frightens me. If you're that fearful of the public, then you're in the wrong profession. You have to be able to articulate a reasonable and justifiable use of all force as a police officer.
Then let's look, and let me please bend to your experience here, because even you indicated that you believe that this officer will likely be found, or at least the grand jury will not return any indictment here. What is it that you have seen there in your experience that tells you that that is the eventual outcome of this case?
Well, I'm just basing that on the requirements that are needed to fulfill an indictment. In other words, the officer's state of mind is huge. And so how do you really combat what someone says is in their head? How do you prove that Officer Wilson is being intellectually dishonest when he said, I was in fear? I believe Officer Wilson created this situation. Had he not gone after Mike Brown for a minor infraction, jaywalking, none of this would have occurred. So if Officer Wilson, upon seeing Mike Brown, was so scared of this 18-year-old unarmed teenager, then he should never have encountered him. He should have made a U-turn and went back to the station and told his supervisors, I'm afraid and I'm going to turn my badge and gun in because these people scare me.
But is that right to say for an officer simply to tell somebody that they don't want to take action that they should be taking to protect a society?
Well, listen, we're talking about a minor infraction. We're talking about jaywalking, and so the action needs to be reasonable. And if that's true, that Mike Brown was jaywalking, Officer Wilson should have only used a reasonable amount of force to overcome whatever resistance he may have been met with. And to escalate a minor traffic infraction to a deadly force incident, I think, is outrageous.
Okay, I'm going to ask you if you would please to hold on just a couple minutes because we're up against the clock. I need to take a break, but I want to come back a few other things, but I want to follow up exactly on what you have just said here. All right, after a short break, we have critics calling for police to be as inconspicuous as possible when dealing with the Ferguson unrest, perhaps even not wear any sort of body armor and not take the proper precautions that you normally would. So how unrealistic is that given the circumstances? And at 27 minutes after the hour, another peg in the board of Roger Goodell, the one demanding his replacement as commissioner of the National Football League. This and a whole lot more coming up right here on Midpoint, where every day we question everything.